Additive or constitutive? We can reflect on someone else's life with two questions in mind. We can ask first how far his life includes whatever experiences or relationships or events or achievements we count as components of a good or decent life. We can ask second how far he recognizes whatever components of the good life his own life contains, whether he sought them, regarded them as valuable, in short, endorsed them as serving critical, not just volitional interests. How should we combine these two types of question? Two views are possible. The additive view holds that we can judge his life a good or bad one without consulting his opinions of its value. If his life has the components of a good life, then it is good for that reason. If he endorses those components, then this increases the goodness of his life. It is frosting on the cake. But if he does not, the ethical value of the components remains. He may have a very good life in virtue of experiences and achievements he does life, perhaps, as if he had endorsed them. The on the other hand, argues that no component may even so much as contribute to the value of a person's life without his endorsement. So if a misanthrope is much loved but disdains the love of others as worthless, his life is not more valuable for their affection. The constitutive view is not the skeptical view that someone's life is good or bad in the critical sense only when and because he thinks it good or bad. Someone might be wrong in thinking his life a good one, and wrong because he counts something as a component of a good life that in fact is not. And he might be wrong in not recognizing and endorsing some feature of his life that, had he recognized it, would have made his life better. The constitutive view denies only that some event or achievement can make a person's life better, again that it does not. Which of these views should we adopt? Once again, each seems to be supported and assumed by familiar intuitions and convictions. Ethical value is objective, not subjective. That fact, which seems to support the transcendent view of ethical standards, also seems to support the additive view. If it is not just up to me to decide what kind of a life is good, then why should it matter for the value of my life what I think about it? In some extreme cases, common sense confirms that argument. Would Hitler not have led a better life if he had been locked up from adolescence, even if he spent the rest of his life dreaming of the horror he could have caused? But other, less dramatic examples provoke contrary intuitions. Even if we think that religion must be part of a good life, can it improve someone's life to force him into a religious observance that he counts worthless? Can it really make sense to say that the misanthrope's life was improved by having the love he did not want? In these cases, we do not feel just that the value of something good, religion, or the love of friends is diminished when it is not appreciated. We feel that its value is obliterated, that there is no value at all unless that value is in some way sponsored by recognition. Once again, some of our intuitions seem in conflict with others, and ethics seems more mysterious as a result. Ethics and community. Our final set of puzzles concerns the unit of ethical value, that is, the entity whose life ethics aims to make good. On the one hand, we feel that ethics is entirely personal. Each of us has ultimate responsibility for deciding what kind of life is right for him. Even a person who unreflectively settles into social grooves is responsible for that choice or non-choice, if less conforming lives were available. And each of us has a personal stake in the life he lives, whether or not he chose it. It is my life that is at stake when I decide where to live or what career to take up or whether to lie for advantage. But yet on some occasions and in some circumstances, that confident division of the ethical world into our own life and the lives of others fails. We sense that the most fundamental ethical unit is collective, not individual, that the question of whether my life is going well is subordinate to the question whether, for some group of which I am a member, our life is going well. We must take care not to dissipate this apparent conflict by confusing it with other connections between personal and social concerns that, however important, do not challenge the distinctly individual character of ethics. Of course, the lives of other people are important to me. Hi. I know that a good life cannot be a selfish or a self-centered one. And of course, I know that my ethical convictions are socially conditioned and constrained, that I cannot even contemplate lives that seem natural in other cultures. If I believe that ethics is indexed rather than transcendent, moreover, I must think that a connection between conviction and culture is not merely psychological but ethical as well, because the right life for me depends in part of which time and nation and culture I live it in. There is no conflict between believing that the success of my life is fully and only my responsibility and that it is connected to community in these various ways. I have in mind, as raising puzzle up for ethics, a different and more radical way of connecting my ethical life to my community. This supposes that a community has an ethical life of its own and that the critical success of any individual's life depends in some degree on the critical success of the life of his community. That assumption is, for many people, a common part of their political sensibility. They feel a personal failure when their own nation acts unjustly or wickedly, even when they have played no part in the injustice and have even tried to prevent it, a failure they do not feel when some other nation acts in the same way. The most notorious and powerful example in our time is the responsibility Germans who were not alive during the Holocaust, or who played no part in it, nevertheless feel for the sins of their political community. Most people fuse their lives in a parallel way to non-political communities. Partners in joint projects, people thrown together in a rescue operation, for example, do not distinguish personal success from the success of the venture. If the venture fails, they have failed, no matter how well they played their own part. Mystery's team. Just this kind of ethical integration, in which an individual's critical interests are dependent on and merged into the critical interests of some group, presuppose ontological priority as well? Does it suppose that the fundamental human units of the universe are groups rather than the individual people who make them up, as some philosophers have thought? If not, how else can ethical integration be explained? Is it consistent to believe, as many of us seem to do, that ethics is both individual and communal? If this is consistent, then which perspective, personal or communal, is the appropriate one to adopt when? C. Models of critical value. These various puzzles and roaries arise, I believe, because our ethical instincts and impulses reflect different and, in some respects, antagonistic ways of conceiving the metric of ethical value. I shall describe two strikingly different values in other spheres or to form more limited judgments, both of which, I believe, play a role in forming our ethical convictions as well. Both models have some grip on us, and our ethical intuitions will remain divided and inconclusive until we settle on one or the other, or on some different or more comprehensive model. The first of these models, the model of impact, holds that the value of a good life consists in its product, that is, in its consequences for the rest of the world. The second, the model of challenge, argues that the goodness of a good life lies in its inherent value as a performance. I shall try to show how these two abstract ideas about the fundamental character of ethics guide our reactions to the roaries and puzzles I listed, and how far the perplexing character of ethics arises from unnoticed conflicts between the two, and our failure, or perhaps our inability, to resolve them. Neither of these two philosophical models of ethical value purports to offer any general argument for ethical value from the ground up, that is, against someone who has a settled and unchallenged conviction that it does not matter what he does with his life so long as he enjoys it. The two models are rather interpretations of the ethical experience of those of us, the great majority, whose ethical convictions or intimations presuppose that it does matter. Je suis en direct. Vas-y, pardon. Attends. Voilà, comme ça il ne voit pas.
Ah non, j'ai peur.
Zoom.
Chaud aussi.
Ouais, il fait chaud. Oh, sinon après, il y a les moustiques.
Non, il n'y en a pas sur le là.
C'est vrai.
Sinon, j'ai mon pied-pied si tu veux.
Ah ouais. Il y en a un aussi en plus. Wesh. Désolée pour ça. When the two models are rather interpretations of the ethical experience of those of us, the great majority, whose ethical... Merci. Ah, c'est pour les moustiques. Merci.
Oui,
Non, c'est pour l'eau. Ouais, merci beaucoup.
Ah non.
Pardon. Après, il faut que je mette là-haut en fait.
Ah ouais, mais c'est irrespirable chez Alec. Elle ouvre rien.
Mais
Rien.
je suis en direct. Mais si, après, il y a des moustiques.
Oh là là.
Et c'est vrai que c'est mieux quand même. Ah, ça referme. Ouais, c'est bizarre. Hein. Ça, c'est vrai. Ouais, ça coince. Ok, je suis là. Look, whose ethical convictions or intimations presuppose that it does matter. The models try to organize our convictions, so far as possible, into a coherent account. The puzzles I described arise because we have too many rather than too few ethical convictions. Some of these seem to conflict with others. On the one hand, we believe that something's significance depends on proportion, so that nothing of infinitesimal size relative to the universe can be really important, for example. On the other hand, we believe, most of us cannot help believing, that it is crucially important how we live in spite of our insignificance. Any skeptical force that this and the other puzzles I described may have is internal rather than external to ethics. It chooses one set of convictions to attack another, rather than attacking ethics from outside as a whole. Il y a une note. Seed work in objectivity and truth, oui, ça on s'en fout.
Tu fais du direct. Ouais. Pourquoi tu te mets pas là? Tu ne seras pas dérangé. Parce que là, t'es dérangé. Tu vas déranger tout le temps.
Ouais, je vais là où je vais là. Attends, je sais plus où j'en suis. Ah voilà, j'arrive. Je finis la phrase. The philosophical models try to defend ethics from that dangerous internal attack by showing how most of our convictions, at least, can be saved if we look at them all in a certain light. The model of impact. Et donc, je vous emmène là-haut. Attendez. Bon, vous n'allez pas voir grand-chose pendant quelques secondes. Et voilà. C'était sympa le voyage. Alors, the model of impact. The impact of a person's life is the difference his life makes to the objective value in the world. Impact plainly figures in our judgments about whose life was a good one. We admire the lives of Alexander Fleming and Mozart and Martin Luther King Jr., and we explain why we do by pointing to penicillin and the marriage of Figaro and what King did for his race and his country. The model of impact analyzes from these examples. It holds that the ethical value of a life, its success in the critical sense, is parasitic on and measured by the value of its consequences for the rest of the world. The model hopes to dissipate the mysteries of ethical value by tying it to another, apparently less mysterious kind of value, the value that objective states of affairs of the world can have. A life can have more or less value, the model claims, not because it is intrinsically more valuable to live one's life in one way rather than another, but because living in one way can have better consequences. We all have opinions about when the world is going better or worse, though of course our opinions differ. Most of us think that things are better when disease is cured, or great works of art are created, or social justice is improved. Some people, they are almost all philosophers, think that the world goes better when the sum of human happiness or pleasure has been increased. The model of impact does not in itself declare for or against these various opinions about which states of affairs are objectively valuable. It merely fuses anyone's opinions about the critical value of his or other people's lives to whatever opinions he has about objective value in states of the world. If I think that a particular painting has added value to the world, then, according to the model of impact, I must think the life of its author a better life for his having painted it. If, more controversially, I think that the world is better when commerce thrives, I will also think that successful entrepreneurs live distinguished lives for that reason. The model connects not just the type, but the quantity of ethical value to the value of a life's consequence. If I think that one artist's work is, as a whole, much greater than the art of another, then I must think the former's life is a much greater life, at least so far as value is given to the lives of each by their art. The model of impact finds support, as I said, in much conventional ethical opinion and rhetoric. It has great difficulty fitting and explaining other common ethical views and practices, however. Many of the goals that people regard as very important are not matters of consequence at all. I said earlier that I believe my own critical interests include having close relations with my children and securing at least some feeble grasp of contemporary science. Other people have parallel convictions. They think it important to do at least something well, to master some field of learning or craft, or to learn to play a musical instrument, for example, not because they will make the world better by so doing. What can it matter that one more person can do something with average skill that other people can do much better? But just in order that they have done it. Many people set wholly adverbial goals for themselves. They want to live, they say, with integrity, doing things their way, with the courage of their convictions. These various ambitions make no sense in the vocabulary of impact. It will make no positive difference to anyone else how much or little grasp I have of cosmology, for example. I will contribute nothing to knowledge of the universe in any case. The model of impact makes many popular views about critical interests seem silly and self-indulgent. The model of challenge. The impact model does not deny the phenomenon of ethical value. It does not deny that people have critical interests and that their lives are better or worse depending on how far these interests are satisfied. But it describes those critical interests in a way that, as we have seen, is constricting of ethical value. It claims that lives go better in virtue of their impact on the objective value of states of affairs. The alternate model that I shall now develop, the model of challenge, rejects that limitation. It adopts Aristotle's view that a good life has the inherent value of a skillful performance. So it holds that events, achievements, and experiences can have ethical value even when they have no impact beyond the life in which they occur. The idea that a skillful performance has an inherent value is perfectly familiar as a kind of value within lives. We admire a complex and elegant dive, for example, whose value persists after the last ripple has died. And we admire people who climbed Mount Everest because, as they said, it was there. The model of challenge holds that living a life is itself a performance that demands skill, that it is the most comprehensive and important challenge we face, and that our critical interests consist in the achievements, events, and experiences that mean that we have met the challenge well. The model of challenge, therefore, offers room for the convictions about critical interest that the model of impact rejects as self-indulgent. It makes sense to suppose, even though it is by no means obvious or uncontroversial, that part of living well is acquiring some flavor of the scientific knowledge of one's time. Nor does the model of challenge reject the intuitions that the model of impact accepts. For it also makes sense to think, indeed this seems obvious, that one way brilliantly to meet the challenge of living well is to reduce the world's suffering by conquering disease. The ecumenical character of the model of challenge might strike you as a weakness, as showing that the model is empty or at least uninformative. The model of impact ties ethical value to objective world value, and so seems at least to offer some guidance as to the actual substance of a good life. The model of challenge, by comparison, allows the idea of ethical value to float free of any other kind of value. If we are free to count doing or having anything at all as meeting the challenge of living well, then the model, it might seem, is not so much a model as a truism. Living well is doing whatever counts as living well. That complaint is misjudged, but both models rely on convictions that they assume we already have. The model of impact assumes that we have convictions about what states of the world are independently valuable. It does not offer to judge these, but simply to explain our ethical values by showing the connection between our opinions about the two kinds of value. The model of challenge also assumes we have convictions about how to live. It does not judge these, but tells us that we will understand our ethical life better if we see them in the way it recommends, as opinions about the skillful performance of an important self-assignment, rather than just as opinions about how we can change the world for the better. It is true, as we saw, that the model of impact makes certain ethical convictions that some people have seem silly. These convictions would probably not survive if the model were taken too hard as exclusive. But the model of challenge also makes certain convictions seem odd, as we shall see. The difference between the two models in this respect is that the convictions the model of challenge makes odd are anyway convictions that few, if any, people would actually hold. D. Ethics and significance. We must now consider the different responses the two models suggest to the various puzzles of ethics, and I begin with the first puzzle I listed, the problem of significance. Since the model of impact locates the value of living a particular way in the independent value of its consequences, it is particularly vulnerable to the charge that the difference even the most powerful human being can make to the state of value in the universe is indescribably puny. Impact can rescue ethics from this objection only by deploying some theory about objective value that stands up to infinity, some theory, that is, that makes the difference people can make to the universe seem much greater than the objection claims it can be. Perhaps that fact explains the appeal for some people of the romantic claim that the greatest value in the universe is aesthetic value, so that the transcendent value of a great work of art is in no way undercut by the fact that it is surrounded by billions of light years of aesthetic nullity. That theory of value, connected to the model of impact, could explain why artistic geniuses have great lives. But if art were the only significant value in the universe, it would no matter how most people lived. Ethics would be only for great souls. There are other, less relentlessly elitist theories of value, however, that might also stand up to the universe. One is theological anthropocentrism. Suppose there is a God who, in spite of the amplitude of his creation, takes special interest in human beings, made in his own image, whose lives can please or displease him mightily. If that were true, then people's lives could make an important difference, judged objectively, to the universe. Or consider a currently much more popular view, hedonistic anthropomorphism. On this view, human pleasure or happiness is the only objective value, even if human beings exist only on a tiny mode and only for a tiny moment. This view of consequent value, tied to the model of impact, produces a recognizably utilitarian ethics. Our lives are good, in the critical sense, to the degree to which we create pleasure or happiness for ourselves and others. Theological and utilitarian ethics are, in most versions, elitist to some degree, but not in the obviously unacceptable way in which the aesthetic theory is elitist. Some people, because they are chosen or blessed or gifted or lucky, will be able to lead critically better lives, measured in the theological or utilitarian way, than others can. But no one is frozen out of ethics, since we can all have some impact on God's satisfaction or on the general level of happiness in the world. Someone can lead a perfectly good life on the utilitarian version, simply by living in a way that produces great pleasure for himself. So the model of impact can provide an answer to the first puzzle of ethics if we can accept some theory of objective value that makes what people can do seem genuinely important to the universe, like aestheticism or theological anthropomorphism or human utilitarianism. The model of challenge responds to the problem of significance in a very different way, for the value of a performance, as an exercise of skill in the face of a challenge, is complete in itself and does not depend on any distinct and independent value. We do not need to think that the stock of lasting value in the world has increased whenever an impressive dive has occurred, or whenever Everest has been climbed in order to see the point of diving or climbing. This response does not acknowledge and try to meet the objection that nothing human beings can do is important in the face of infinity, as the model of impact does. The model of challenge sets the objection aside as based on a misconception of the kind of value ethical value is. Nor does this model rely on the independent importance on some event, even when it recognizes the importance of making a difference in the world. It is obviously compelling that making great music and conquering pneumonia and reducing racial injustice are among the good ways to live, and we could not accept the model of challenge if it could not find as comfortable a place for these judgments as the model of impact can. It does not distort the idea of performance or challenge to say that someone who has eliminated a great deal of misery in the world has done a skillful job of leading his life. That is not, however, simply a way of incorporating the model of impact within the model of challenge as a compartment, because the former will not, as the latter must, make the independent value of the achievement the measure of its ethical value. For the contribution someone's invention or discovery or creation makes to the goodness of his life, on the challenge model is sensitive to much besides the independent value of what he has created. The ethical value of an invention might be thought to depend, for example, on the degree of difficulty involved in its making, or in its originality, or in the degree to which its author made full use of or stretched his abilities, or in the intensity of his dedication, or in the way in which his work flowed from his sense of his role in or his dedication to a particular community or tradition. The model of challenge does not, of course, in itself stipulate which of these or hundreds of other possible considerations should enter into deciding how great a contribution a particular achievement makes to the overall skill with which someone has lived his life. My point is the same one again. That treating achievements as having ethical value in that way, rather than just in virtue of their impact alone, allows more subtlety in our judgments of the success of our own and other people's lives. The challenge model also allows us to celebrate some kinds of achievements, the creation of great art, for example, without the elitist consequence that only lives capable of that kind of success are really worth leading. Or that, if the lives of two artists are good lives in virtue of the art they have created, the one who has created better art has for that reason had a greater life. I recognize that, in this respect, the name model of challenge might be misleading. I do not mean that only lives full of internal challenge, given over to heroic deeds like climbing impossible mountains, can be successful lives on this model. I mean rather that life itself is to be seen as a challenge. Skill at that challenge might be thought to require avoiding rather than embracing arduous exploits in favor of a life more suited to one's talents or situation, or satisfactions or cultural expectations. The point, yet again, is formal. Seeing ethical value as the value of a performance rather than as tied to the independent value of a product allows a further range of considerations and beliefs to enter ethical judgment, though it does not itself select among any particular set of these as more appropriate than others. E. Transcendent or indexed. Since the model of impact ties ethical value to the independent value of states of affairs, ethical value must be transcendent under that model, because it is very implausible that the independent value of the kinds of impact that make lives good depends on the time and location of the impact. We might perhaps imagine bizarre theories of value that would index the value of states of affairs temporally or geographically. But any plausible or familiar theory would be immune to indexing. If we think that the only objective good is God's pleasure or the happiness of human beings, then we cannot think that the same amount of God's pleasure or overall human happiness could be less valuable at one moment of the world's history than at another. That must also be true of more complex theories about objective value that assign, for example, different value to different components of an overall state of affairs. Any particular complex structure of independent value must have the same total value whenever or wherever it occurs. So the model of impact, on any plausible interpretation of the value or values it assumes, implies that ethical value is transcendent. Of course, what creates ethical value, according to any particular interpretation, will depend on circumstances. What makes people happy in developed economies may be different from what makes them happy in economically simpler societies. But the metric of value, of how far someone's life has succeeded in being good, must remain everywhere the same. How much objective and timeless value, on the right theory of independent value, has he added to the world stock? The model of challenge, on the other hand, tempts those who accept it to the view that ethical value is indexed rather than transcendent. Someone who accepted the model could conceive conceivably, it is true, adopt a transcendent view of what a good performance of living is. He might think, for example, that living well only means living with style, and he might hold some timeless view about what style consists in. But any such timeless account would be fatally superficial. It seems irresistible that living well, judged as a performance, means among other things living in a way responsive and appropriate to one's culture and other circumstances. A life of chivalrous and courtly virtue, chivalrous, might be a very good one in 12th century Bohemia, but not in Brooklyn now. An analogy to art will be useful, though dangerous, here. I mentioned earlier the opinion some people have that great art has independent and timeless value, so that the world is objectively better for having a brilliant painting in it, no matter how that painting arrived. But that opinion, we should now notice, overlooks an important feature of art. A painting does have an independent value that we might call its product value. This is the power it has to excite aesthetic and other forms of valuable experiences. But a painting's product value is different from its artistic value, which is the value it has not independently but in virtue of how it was produced. We need the distinction between product and artistic value to explain the different values of an original and of a perfect, undetected copy. The value we attach to great art reflects not just its value as a product, but our respect for the performance that produced it, considered as a skillful response to a well-judged artistic challenge. Art offers a better analogy to living, according to the challenge model, than the analogies I used earlier. For the challenge of art, unlike the challenge of diving well or climbing a difficult mountain, includes the challenge of defining as well as securing success, and if living well is regarded as a challenge, defining what it is to live well must be part of that challenge too. Artists are not furnished with blueprints, even in the most academic or conventionalized moments. When Duccio drew the Sienese tradition out of the Byzantine, or Duchamp hung his urinal on a gallery wall, or Pollock dripped paint over a canvas on the floor, each made a claim about the character of artistic achievement. There is no settled view about what artistic achievement is, as there is, I imagine, about achievement in diving. We expect artists to make claims that, if successful, will expand or at least change what the tradition counts as good. The most daring of these claims, we might say, offer to make something of nothing, to make artistic value out of a kind of performance in which none was recognized before. If we treat ethical value as the value of a performance rather than as the independent value of a product, then we will take the same view of a skillful performance of living. There is no settled canon of skill in living, and some people's lives, at least, make claims about ethical skill that, if widely accepted, would change prevailing views on the subject, and might even launch what would seem a new model of living well, making, once again, ethical value from nothing. I do not mean that living a life well requires breaking with an ethical custom or tradition, or even developing it in some particularly original way. The model of challenge makes room for that suggestion. It makes room for the romantic injunction that one should make of one's life an original work of art. But it does not insist on that romantic ideal or presuppose that less original lives must be less successful ones. I do not agree with that. I offer the analogy between ethics and art not to endorse the romantic ideal, but to make a very different point. It is remarkably implausible and foreign to almost everyone's aesthetic impulses to suppose that artistic value is transcendent, that painting in the same way always has the same artistic value, that there is, in principle, one absolutely greatest way to make art against which all others must be judged. Artists enter the history of art at a particular time, and the artistic value of their work must be judged in that light, not because their circumstances limit how close they can come to the perfect ideal of artistry, but for the opposite reason that their circumstances help to fix what is, for them, the ideal toward which they must struggle. An artist's situation in the history of art, and the political, technological, and social conditions of his age, enter, we might say, into the parameters of the challenge he faces. Duccio's challenge was very different from Duchamp's or Pollock's. Even if we think that contemporary art must explore and comment on the materials of modern technology, we do not count it a limitation on an artist of the Trecento that he did not have resin or epoxy available. Even if we think that Christian mythology would be an impoverished religious subject now, we do not count Duccio's work banal. So the artistic analogy reminds us that the value of a performance can be indexed without being subjective, because the indexing can be provided by parameters of challenge that change with time and situation, but that nevertheless pose categorical demands. Living well, like painting well, means responding in an appropriate way to one's situation, though of course the ethical challenge of a particular time and place is very different from its artistic challenge. Art and ethics, on this view, are indexed in the same way. Both call for a decision, as part of the challenge they present, about the right response to the complex circumstances in which the decision must be made. It is, in both cases, a further question what the right ethical response for any particular person in any particular circumstances actually is, or whether there is a single right response even for a particular person or circumstance, or only a set of these. The model of challenge, at the level of abstraction we are exploring, does not attempt to answer these further questions. It only emphasizes what kind of questions they are, that they require a personal response to the full particularity of situation, not the application to that situation of a timelessly ideal life. F. Limitations and parameters. Je crois que c'est juste là, jusqu'à la page 284, cette partie. Ouais. We must now explore the distinction we have just noticed. Under any plausible version of the model of impact, all the circumstances of any person's actual life act as limitations on the quality of the life he can have. The ideal life is always the same. It is a life creating as much independent value, as powerful a pleasing of God, or as much human happiness as it is conceivable for a human being to create. Circumstances act as limits on the degree to which the ideal can be achieved. Mortality, for example, is a very important limit. Most people could create more pleasure if they lived longer. Talent, wealth, personality, language, technology, and culture provide other limits, and their force as limits will be much greater for some people, and in some times and places, than others. If we adopt the talent view of ethics, however, and treat living well as responding in the right way to one's situation, then we must treat some of the circumstances in which a particular person lives in a different way as parameters that help define what a good performance of living would be for him. Someone's living well, according to the challenge model, includes his sensing what the challenge he faces in making a life really is, just as an artist's painting well includes his sensing which aspects of his overall circumstances define the right tradition for him to continue or to defy. We have no settled template for that decision in art or in ethics, and no philosophical model can provide one for the circumstances in which each of us lives are enormously complex. These circumstances include our health, our physical powers, our tenure of life, our material resources, our friendships and associations, our commitments and traditions of family and race and nation, the constitutional and legal system under which we live, the intellectual and literary and philosophical opportunities and standards offered by our language and culture, and thousands of other aspects of our world as well. Anyone who reflects seriously on the question which of the various lives he might lead is right for him will consciously or unconsciously discriminate among these, treating some as limits and others as parameters. I might treat the fact that I am an American, for example, as just a fact that in some cases might help and in others hinder my leading the life I think best. Or I might treat my nationality as a parameter and assume, whether or not self-consciously, that being an American is part of what makes a particular life the right one for me. No philosophical model can adjudicate this distinction, certainly not in any detail. Most people will sort their circumstances into the two camps almost automatically, and those who do reflect on the distinction are unlikely to draw from any overall theory the conclusions they reach. But if I do not think ethics transcendent, if I do not think that one life would be the greatest for all human beings who will ever have lived, then I must treat some of the facts that distinguish my situation from that of other people as parameters rather than limitations. My biological, social, and national associations, those I was born or fell into, not those I chose, seem obvious candidates to me, though they may not to others. The fact that I am a member of the American political community is not a limitation on my ability to lead a good life that I could describe in isolation from that connection. It rather states the condition of a good life for me. It is a life appropriate to someone whose situation includes that connection. But of course, I cannot treat everything about my situation as a parameter without destroying ethics for myself altogether. Suppose I took my own character, desires, resources, opportunities, and predilections to mark parameters for me. I say that the life good for me is a life good for someone with exactly my present material wealth, education, tastes, and ambitions. I would have indexed my account of the good life so thoroughly to my own immediate situation that it could no longer offer a challenge at all. So living well requires more discrimination about limits and parameters than either of the two extreme views that counts everything as limitation or everything as parameter. It is fortunate that most of the discriminations we need are, as I said, more or less automatic, carried in our culture like so much else about ethics. But we can nevertheless identify some of the decisions we have covertly made, and we can force ourselves to consider whether they have been made in the right way. Someone might come to think, for example, that his professional or religious or some other connections are even more fundamental in defining the challenge he faces in living than his political ones are, and he may therefore seek citizenship in some other nation. When we reflect on the structure of our ethical convictions in this way, we notice important complexities. We notice, for example, that many of our parameters are normative. They define our ethical situation not in terms of our actual situation, but in terms of our situation as we suppose it should be. Our lives may go badly, in other words, not just because we are unwilling or unable properly to respond to the circumstances we have, but because we have the wrong circumstances. We do not even face the challenge we identify as the right one. Even if we do the best we can in the circumstances we do face, we do badly measuring our success against the chance we believe we ought to have been given, and it is the latter that defines a good life for us. Consider, for example, the way most of us treat our mortality. We do not count the fact that we will die someday, much as we might fear or resent it, as a limitation on the value of the life we can have. We do not think that our lives can be at best only a tiny fraction as good as the lives people could lead if they lived to biblical ages or forever. We count a life good on that score if it lasts long beyond human standards, so that it can have the kinds of interrelatedness of age and generation and the other kinds of internal complexity that our cultural standards of a good life presuppose. See Age in Encyclopedia of the Italian Renaissance. But we do not judge the goodness of someone's life only by asking how well it occupied whatever span of years it in fact had. We make assumptions about how long a human life can reasonably be expected to be, given appropriate resources of nutrition and medicine, and if someone dies very young by that standard, we count that a tragedy. His life, all else equal, was only partly as good as it might have been. Many of our ethical parameters are normative in that way. They help to define the challenge that people should face. A life not permitted that challenge is for that very reason a worse one. That fact points the way to a further complexity. We must distinguish between what I shall call hard and soft parameters. Parameters enter into the description of any challenge or assignment. They describe the conditions of successful performance. Hard parameters state essential conditions of a specified performance. If these conditions are violated, the performance is a total failure, no matter how successful it is in other respects. The formal structure of a sonnet imposes hard parameters. It ruins a sonnet to add an extra line, no matter how beautiful it is. Soft parameters also define an assignment, but any violation of a soft parameter is a serious, compromising flaw, a crack in the golden bowl. That compromise is not fatal and can be overcome. Compulsory figures and competitive figure skating are, I believe, soft parameters. It is part of the assignment that the skater execute a particular figure, and any deviations, no matter how beautifully executed, count as faults that necessarily cost points. But deviations do not mean winning no points at all, and a performance that includes a particularly brilliant deviation may win more points overall than a lackluster but perfectly faithful one. Most of us, at least, believe that the parameters that define success in living a life are all soft. It counts against the goodness of someone's life that it was cut short by an early death, because a good life for a human being is a life that occupies and makes good use of at least a normal lifespan. But a short life can nevertheless be a brilliant success, as Mozart's was. Some soft parameters require choices, and these may pose conflicts or dilemmas. Suppose I think that my life must be a life appropriate for an American and also for a Zionist, and then I come to think, rightly or wrongly, that accepting both these allegiances fully would tear my life apart. I might then think that the best life for me required some compromise, or that it required accepting one parameter and rejecting the other. Or I might think that no choice, in these circumstances, could really be thought better than the other, that I must just choose, knowing that my life will be marred either way. The challenge model gives more sense and point to all these circumstances and dilemmas than the impact model can. G. Justice as parameter. The fourth set of puzzles I described is generated by the interplay between ethics and morality. Can someone lead a better life in virtue of injustice? I want now to distinguish two versions of that question. First, how is the critical value of someone's life affected by his own unjust acts? Second, how is it affected by the fact that his society is unjust, though not through his own acts? The impact model, in its abstract form, takes up no position on the first of these questions about the ethical consequences of one's own unjust acts, because we can find interpretations of it that are compatible with either answer. On one interpretation, for example, we do good for the world only when we make it less unjust, and on that interpretation, no one could have a better life through behavior that produced more injustice in the world. On another interpretation, the greatest life is a life of producing great art. On that interpretation, Cézanne's draft dodging made his life unambiguously a greater one, even if that life was indefensibly unjust. But the model of impact, even in its abstract form, does take up a position about the second question. It holds that the fact that someone lives in an unjust society makes no difference in itself to the success or failure of his own life. It seems undeniable that in the United States now some people, I shall call them the rich, have more wealth than justice allows, and others, the poor, have less. A rich man may use his wealth to make a positive impact on the world, however. He may use it to create or sponsor great art, or to finance his own or others' research into antibiotics, or to work in politics for greater equality, or even to help the poor more directly by giving his money to them. However we interpret objective value, the impact of his life is likely to have more value than it would have had if he had only average wealth, and, since the unjust situation, we are assuming, is not of his making, there is no negative impact value in his own life to set against the gain. Now consider the poor man. He almost undoubtedly will have a worse life, measured by its impact, than he could have had if he had more wealth. But that is in no way the consequence of the fact that his having less wealth is unjust. It is not the injustice of his share of resources, but the absolute amount of that share that sets limits to the impact he can have. We would not judge his life a better one if we changed our mind about justice and decided that his share was just after all. The model of challenge suggests a very different approach to the two questions. Someone who accepts that model, and so accepts that some aspects of our circumstances must count as normative parameters of living well, will find it difficult not to regard justice as figuring among those normative parameters. Certainly, resources must figure as parameters in some way. They cannot count only as limitations, because we cannot think that the ideally best life is the life of someone with all the resources available to him that imagination might conceive. We cannot describe the challenge of living well, that is, without making some assumptions about the resources a good life should have available to it. We must therefore find some suitable account of the way in which resources enter ethics as parameters of the good life, and we have, I think, no alternative but to bring justice into that story by stipulating that a good life is a life suited to the circumstances that justice requires. If living well includes assigning ourselves the right challenge in living, and that it in turn means stipulating the right resources by way of parameter, then any normative convictions we have about the right distribution of resources seem inescapably pertinent. It would be bizarre to declare as are considered moral judgments, that it is appropriate for people each to have a fair share of resources, defined in some particular way, and not also to think, in making an ethical judgment about what circumstances we should treat as appropriate in declining what life would be good for us, that fair circumstances, so defined, are the appropriate ones. We cannot avoid that conclusion by saying that what is morally appropriate is not necessarily what is ethically appropriate, because the idea of normative parameters would make no sense if we insisted on that distinction. We must set the resources parameters of a life well lived, so far as we can, so that these respect our sense of justice. If living well means responding in the right way to the right challenge, then someone's life goes worse when he cheats others for his own unfair advantage. It also goes worse when, even through no fault of his own, he lives in an unjust society, because then he cannot face the right challenge whether he is rich, with more than justice allows him to have, or poor, with less. That explains why, on the challenge model, injustice, just on its own, is bad for people. Someone who is denied what justice entitles him to have leads a worse life just for that reason. He leads a worse life than he would with the same absolute resources in, say, a poorer age where no one had more than he does. I do not mean, of course, that the absolute value or quality of the resources a person commands makes no difference to the life he can lead, so long as he has a just share of whatever there is. Someone who lives in a richer community or age, with a just share of its wealth, faces a more interesting and valuable challenge, and can lead a more exciting, diverse, complex, and creative life just for that reason, much as someone playing chess has a more valuable opportunity than someone playing tic-tac-toe. Lives can be better in different ways, and facing a more valuable challenge is one of them. Recognizing justice as a parameter of ethics does, however, limit the goodness of the life someone can lead in any given economic circumstances. I could have a better life, I assume, if circumstances changed so that justice allowed me more resources. It does not follow, however, that I could have a better life with an unjustly larger share of resources now. But is it really true that no one can ever, in any circumstances, lead a better life by having more than justice permits? Plato's view has some plausibility if we understand him to mean that justice is a hard parameter of living well, that no one can improve his life in the critical sense by using more resources than he is entitled to have, any more than someone can improve a sonnet by adding more lines to it. Once we accept that the best life means a life responding well to the right circumstances, and that the right circumstances are circumstances of justice, we become aware of how difficult it is to lead anything like the right life when circumstances are far from just. We become aware, indeed, of how difficult it is even to imagine a wholly good life then. Our own society is unjust, so our culture offers no examples of lives that flourished or are deemed successful in circumstances as they should be. Those of us who are rich cannot establish the relations with other people, particularly those who are poor, because we are rich. That would be important to a good life in a just society. We may try to live with only the resources we think we would have in a fair society, doing the best we can with the surplus to repair injustice through private charity. But since a just distribution cannot be established counterfactually, but only dynamically through just institutions, we are unable to judge what share of our wealth is fair. On the other hand, simply ignoring the fact of injustice and spending what we have in satisfying the volitional interests our culture recommends to people of our means hardly seems an appropriate response. We may work in politics, but we will be unlikely to do much good, and our failure to make the community more just will make our own lives worse, because the community's failure is then ours as well. So once we identify the conditions of a really good life in a clear-headed way, we may have considerable sympathy with Plato's view that justice is a hard parameter of ethics, that nothing can redeem a life spoiled by the misfortune of living in an unjust state. Nevertheless, that hard view does seem too strong. An alternative position, that justice is a soft rather than a hard parameter, would also make justice constitutive of ethics, but would be less destructive of recalcitrant ethical intuitions. On this view, there is someone supported by unjust wealth cannot succeed fully in meeting the appropriate challenge, which is to live a life suited to someone in a just community. His life is nevertheless not automatically worthless, and might be a very good life. Indeed, like a skating performance that deviates from compulsory figures, it might even, in rare cases, be a better life than he could have led in a society perfectly just. That will not be true of most people who have more wealth than they should, however. They will do nothing so brilliant or amazing with a surplus over what justice would allow them that it will compensate for their inability to lead a good life in a just community. Some of them may enjoy their life more than they would in such a community, of course. That does not mean that their lives are any better in the critical sense. We nevertheless concede that some genius financed by unjust wealth, Michelangelo by the Medici, may achieve a life greater than anyone could in a more just state. As Harry Lime told us in The Third Man, the Italian Quattrocento produced tyranny in the Renaissance. Switzerland in the same period produced democracy and the cuckoo clock. A child whose life is saved by hideously expensive medical treatment available to him only through his parents' unjust wealth, treatment that would not be available to anyone in a just society, will very likely lead a better life in consequence. These concessions seem required by our sense of ethical possibility, but though they qualify Plato's insight, they do not undermine it. On the model of challenge, Plato was nearly right. H. Additive or constitutive? Our next set of puzzles worries about the connection between our convictions and the goodness of the lives we lead. How far and in what way does my having a good life depend on my thinking it good? We instinctively assume that ethical standards are objective. A particular life we think cannot be good for someone just because he thinks it is. He can have made a mistake in thinking it good. But we know that convictions play a more important part in ethics than that flat statement suggests. How could it be in someone's interests, even in the critical sense, to lead a life he despises and thinks unworthy? So we are also tempted to say, on reflection, that ethical value must be subjective after all. Having a good life must be a matter of ethical satisfaction, which means in the end that it must be a matter of thinking one's life good. But then the rope turns back on itself again. I cannot think my life good unless I think that its goodness does not depend on my thinking it so. The model of impact cuts that knot by insisting that ethical value is fully objective, so that someone can indeed lead a better life than some alternative life he might have led, even when he thinks it a much worse life. Ethical value is additive rather than constitutive on the impact model, because ethical value is a matter of the independent value a life adds to the universe, and that cannot depend on how much value a person thinks he is adding. Creating great art does not require the artist's belief that he is creating great art, nor does someone's improving the happiness of others require that he believe he is doing so, let alone that he believes he is leading a better life by doing so. In some cases, the ethical convictions of the actor might add to the impact of what he does. Perhaps I can create more pleasure by what I do if others know that I believe it does me good too. But that extra impact is incremental. The impact model would therefore have no trouble explaining the common feeling I reported earlier, that Hitler would have had a better life for himself, as well as for the rest of the world, if he had been locked up or even killed soon after birth. The impact of Hitler's life would then have been much more favorable, even if he would then have had no impact at all, and so his life would have been a much better one, in the critical sense, for him as well. The challenge view resolves these puzzles differently. On any plausible interpretation of that model, the connection between conviction and value is constitutive. My life cannot be better for me in virtue of some feature or component I think has no value. Even in its abstract form, the model presses toward that constitutive view. For intention is part of performance. We do not give credit to a performer for some feature of his performance that he was struggling to avoid or would not recognize, even in retrospect, as good or desirable. An art student's performance is not improved when his teacher pushes his hand across the canvas or drags it back from a stroke that would ruin what he has already done. The misanthrope's life is not made better by the friendship he thinks pointless. Of course, it would have been better for everyone else if Hitler had died in his cradle. But on the challenge view, it makes no sense to say that his own life would have been better, as distinct from no worse, if that had happened. There is nothing comparable under that model to a negative impact on the world. It might be useful to consider At this point, how this difference between the two models affects a standard issue in political philosophy, the legitimacy of coercive critical paternalism. Is it proper for a state to try to make people's lives better by forcing them to act in ways that they think make their lives worse? A good deal of coercive paternalism is not critical in character. The state makes people wear seatbelts in order to keep them from harm that it assumes they already think bad enough to justify such constraints, even if they would not actually fasten their seatbelts if not forced to do so. But some states claim a right or even an obligation to make people's lives better in the critical sense, not only against their will, that is, but against their conviction. That motive for coercion has not been of much practical importance in our time. Theocratic colonizers aim at their own salvation, not at the well-being of those they force to convert, and sexual bigots act out of hatred, not out of concern for those whose behavior they find immoral. Nevertheless, some philosophers do claim paternalistic motives. Some so-called communitarians or perfectionists want to compel people to vote, for example, on the ground that civic-minded people lead better lives. The model of impact accepts the theoretical basis of critical paternalism. I do not mean that anyone who accepts that model must approve paternalism. He might think that officials would misuse their power or make worse judgments about ethical value than ordinary people would on their own. But he would see the point of ethical paternalism. It could make sense to him, for example, that people's lives would go better if they were forced to pray, because in that case they might please God more and so have a better impact, even though they remained atheists. The challenge view, on the other hand, rejects the root assumption of critical paternalism, that a person's life can be improved by forcing him into some act or abstinence he thinks valueless. Someone who accepts the challenge model might well think that religious devotion is an essential part of how human beings should respond to their place in the universe, and therefore that devotion is part of living well. But he cannot think that involuntary religious observance, prayer in the shadow of the rock, has any ethical value. He may think that an active homosexual blights his life by a failure to understand the point of sexual love, but he cannot think that a homosexual who obtains against his own convictions and only out of fear has therefore overcome that defect in his life. On the challenge model, that is, it is performance that counts, no mere external result, and the right motive or sense is necessary to the right performance. It overstates the point to say that the challenge model rules out any form of paternalism, because the defect it finds in paternalism can be cured by endorsement, provided that the paternalism is sufficiently short-term and limited so that it does significantly constrict choices if the endorsement never comes. We know that a child who is forced to practice music is very likely later to endorse the coercion by agreeing that it did, in fact, make his life better. If he does not, he has lost little ground in a life that makes no use of his training. Oui? Ah, j'arrive! In any case, however, endorsement must be genuine, and it is not genuine when someone is hypnotized or brainwashed or frightened into conversion. Endorsement is genuine only when it is itself the agent's performance, not the result of another person's thoughts being piped into his brain. I say a bit more about this issue in chapter 5. Je reviens tout de suite.